So what I'm going to talk about tonight is briefly track through the last 30 years rather, flying and displaying vintage aircraft. But just to prove I'm not a hooligan, really make the point that I've been exceptionally lucky. So many people have trusted me with their beautiful airplanes. In 72 and 73, I was the Strike Command display pilot on the Hunter from Chivner, and that really whetted my appetite for getting into display flying. And so when I left the Air Force in 84, I really looked to try and get into the civil side of display flying. The other thing I did, which was quite amusing, was I bought a share in this. Now it looks like a Focke-Wulf 190, but it's actually a half-size Focke-Wulf 190. If you look at the pilot's head, you can see that that is actually overscale for a full-size Focke-Wulf 190. You couldn't open the canopy in flight, and the forward view was absolutely atrocious on landing because your eyes are so much lower than they would be in the full-size one. The cockpit was, to say the least, tight, and there was little room for anything in there. You could just get a little bag down the side with a clean pair of underpants and a clean shirt, and that was it. But I flew that thing for about 5 years, and the furthest I took it away was Sumborough, which was a bit of a jag. So I phoned up a mate of mine who was squadron leader ops at Lossiemouth and said, can I come through Lossie? And he said, yeah, fine, no problem at all. And as it's you, we won't charge you a landing fee. So that was very nice of him. So I trotted into Lossiemouth from Sumborough. And it was the time when they were operating Shackletons at Lossiemouth. This thing has got a 12-gallon fuel tank, and of course the Bowser driver came along with a nozzle fit for a Shackleton, and we just had to dribble the fuel in. The 8 gallons of fuel that I needed, we dribbled it in slowly, and when I said to the Scottish gentleman, how much for the fuel, he looked at me strangely and said, oh, that was spillage. And I flew Spencer's Hunter for him while I was still in the Air Force, but it was due to that link that I got the big break. Spencer unfortunately crashed his Sea Fury at Waddington and got out of the business of vintage aircraft. His wife made him sell up his fleet, but eventually he got back into it, decided to try and get back in. And his secretary knew I was interested in getting involved in the big stuff, so she phoned me up one day and said, would you like to give him a call? And I gave him a call about this beast which he'd just bought. Sitting on the ground at Southend, a beautiful airplane, absolutely pristine aircraft. And I'm sitting in the cockpit. I'd had the notes for a week or so I'd read through the notes. I'm sitting in the cockpit. I've got Spencer, the owner, sitting on the left wing, Jack Brown sitting on the right wing, and we've been through everything, briefing it, how you start it, takeoff speeds, landing speeds, you name it, the whole lot. And it's got a dicky seat in the back. It's two-seater, but no controls in the back. So at the end of the briefing, I was happy, Jack was happy, Spencer looked reasonably happy, and we decided it was time to go. So Spencer said to Jack, are you going with him? And Jack said, not bloody likely, there's no point killing two of us. Now this particular airplane, the stock Mustang, had 200 gallons, 100 in each wing, and eventually then they put 80 gallons in the back here, which is where the seat is in this airplane. So the stock airplane had 280 gallons internal, and they could hang 100 gallons under each wing, so 480 gallons, which is why they could go to Berlin and back without any problems. Coming back from that trip, on the way back down towards Ostend, I was sitting in this Mustang, and you can see there there's a little hatch there. You can see the catch for it. In that hatch, which was all beautifully lined in the compartment, was a Diners Club Gold card, which had typed on the back, whoever is flying the Mustang. I was flying the Mustang, and I got 5,000 quid in cash in my pocket, and I thought, should I just carry on south? See how far. If I'd had my wife in the back, I probably would have done, but common sense prevailed. And so I was going to do some aerobatics, and brother-in-law in the back was quite happy about aeros. When Lucas Radar said, keep your eye open if you're going to do some aeros, holding just south of you is a pair of Hawks. Obviously the display Hawk and the spare. So forget the aerobatics, let's go and have at this pair of Hawks. And why not? The bounce worked out really well, and before they saw us, I was in about 500 yards on the number 2, closing quite quickly, whereupon the number 2 spat off high, That worried me for a while because I thought he was going to come back down and have a go at me. But as it transpired, he was a solo student from Valley, just flying the spare for the display man, and he was told to clear off and to go away and don't come back, because what was about to happen was highly illegal in RAF terms. We then got into a knockdown drag-out 1v1 combat, which went on for 15 minutes and was fantastic. He never won. I can't claim a kill either, but he was never anywhere near the back of me. The Mustang has got a reputation for poor stalling characteristics. Well, it never gave me any trouble at all. Just left it power set at max continuous, and like the Hunter, the Mustang has got combat flap, so you can put out 10 degrees of flap up to 410 miles an hour, 20 degrees up to 275 miles an hour. So every time I needed it, I could use the flap, and the Mustang just behaved perfectly. The big advantage the Hawk had was power, that he could leave the fight anytime he wanted by pulling vertically up, which is what he did. Every time I got into a really threatening position, he just went straight up. The first time I tried to follow him, I ran fresh out of energy, and it was a stupid idea. But when we milled around for a bit, and he did it again, went up, this time I went down. So I was getting energy, because he was going to come back down and have a go at me, and I now had the energy to pull up into him. And we were doing these vertical passes with canopy to canopy, about 30 or 40 feet apart. Brother-in-law in the back thought it was fantastic. And as soon as we merged, I dropped 20 flat and straight in behind him again. This went on for 15 minutes. And eventually, after 15 minutes, Lucas Radar, presumably watching these two blips doing this round and round each other, said, "You can stop playing now. The Patrie de France have landed. You can come back." So we went back and landed. The student was sworn to secrecy, and it was a Friday night in an officer's mess bar, and the secrecy lasted about half a second. And I think the display pilot was very good. He bought quite a lot of beer. This was Doug's Mark 9 Spitfire. Don't worry about the smoke. It's a Boscombe down during an air display. And it was for this display that he needed a pilot. So in June 1990, I climbed into the Spitfire for the first time. Mr. Arnold, being Mr. Arnold, the only way you get rich is being tight-fisted. He said, "You're not doing circuits at Biggin Hill, 2,000 yards of runway. You're not doing circuits at Biggin Hill, it's too damned expensive. You can go down to Headcorn." Now, Headcorn has got 800 metres of grass, but it was perfectly fine in the Spitfire. Spitfire loved it. So my first ever landing was at Headcorn on 800 metres of grass, which was lovely. I did 3 landings, full stops, taxi back, get airborne, do another one. And when I went in and asked Chris Friedman, who owned Headcorn, how much I owed him for landing fees, the reply was unprintable, and it was, just do a fly past when you leave. Spitfires do not pay landing fees at Headcorn. The interesting thing about the Spitfire compared with the Mustang is that obviously things like the narrow track undercarriage, but like all aeroplanes, it's never over till it's over in terms of flying. And I did 2 landings at Boscombe Down for this particular display in identical conditions, about 5 knots of crosswind in absolutely identical conditions. On the first one, it rolled out as sweet as a nut, did nothing at all. Did the second one about 40 minutes later, and about 60 knots, it decided it was going off the side of the runway. It didn't go off the side of the runway. I managed to keep it straight, but why it did it, I have absolutely no idea. It got a mind of its own. Doug was always importing aircraft. He got this thing about buying and selling aeroplanes, and in December 1990 he imported a Wildcat and a Bearcat from the States. They boiled the battery doing a ground run on that one, which was the one I was going to take first. So Doug said, "Right, get in the Bearcat and take it to Biggin Hill." Now, I hadn't even looked at the notes for the Bearcat, and it's a completely different kettle of fish. It's at the end of the war, end of the single piston engine fighters. It's got 2,200 horsepower. It's the smallest airframe you can fit around that engine, and it's a bomb. It goes like an absolute rocket. So to say I was petrified is slightly understating the case. It's also beginning to get, daylight is beginning to become a concern because he wants them both back at Biggin Hill. To cut a very long story short, I ended up sitting in the thing for 30 minutes while they prepped it, and then taxied out and got airborne from Ipswich, sliding around on the wet grass, taxiing out. But fortunately, with the tail wheel locked, the takeoff was no problem at all. Got airborne, closed the canopy, got the gear up, and went off to Biggin Hill and found out what a beautiful aeroplane it is. Absolutely controllable aeroplane. The Americans have a way of writing in their pilot's notes that this aeroplane has demonstrated the capability of taking off and landing in a crosswind of X from either side. In the case of the Bearcat, X is 45 miles an hour. And now that's a carrier-borne aeroplane, but it's got a 45 mile an hour crosswind limit, which is fantastic when you think about it. And it really is very, very controllable. One of the best big pistons around. This thing, however, is not something you want to deal with in a crosswind. As you can see from the wing like that, you've got a problem built in already with a crosswind. But other than that, it's a stunning aeroplane. Obviously it's the Corsair, US Navy aircraft, but the US Navy wouldn't land it on carriers. In fact, the first people who landed on carriers were the Fleet Air Arm. The Americans thought it was dangerous, and the US Navy gave it to the Marines because the US Navy didn't want it. Eventually, they got to grips with it, and it is a very fine aeroplane, apart from the fact you don't want to land it in a crosswind. What I'd like to do now is just look at some technical details, and I'd like to look at 4 different aeroplanes very briefly. The Hurricane, the Spitfire, the Mustang, and then the Sky Raider. Because basically, certainly as far as the Hurricane, the Spitfire, and the Mustang are concerned, you've got 3 generations of aircraft, and there are 3 distinct improvements between each of them. This is the Hurricane, obviously we're going to start off with. Interesting to note the legs coming up asymmetrically. Remember that in those days, early days of hydraulics, it was only a 1000 psi system. Difficulty in getting all the legs to come up together, and even on the Spitfire is the same. The legs come up asymmetrically. Diving into the office. Well, it's very clear that in the 1930s the word ergonomics had not been invented. It's a mishmash. The cockpit is completely open. It's a steel tube fuselage. The covering is there purely to keep the draft out. It offers nothing for the strength of the fuselage. And as we can see here, that's the kind of structure that you've got in the cockpit. If you drop anything, that's it. You ain't ever going to get it back. So you wear a flying suit and you tie everything to yourself. The Hurricane and the Spitfire started off with 2-blade fixed pitch props. When they went to a 3-blade prop with variable pitch, the Spitfires, we'll see, put everything on one quadrant. Unfortunately in the Hurricane, that's the throttle there and that's the prop control there, which means you've got a bit of a handful moving from one side to the other to get when you're increasing RPM. On the other side of the office, again, it's wide open as you can see, and what I'd like to just look at is this little device here in a bit more detail. It's actually a gear lever out of a Ford Popular car by the look of it, and it's believe it or not, it's the undercarriage and the flap selector all on the same handle. So it's an H gearbox arrangement, rocket outboard, and it's flaps up, flaps down. Rocket inboard, and it's undercarriage up, undercarriage down. And of course, like the Spitfire, you've got to change hands to get the gear up. So you're like that for takeoff, and then you've got to change hands to get the gear up. If you've forgotten to do the throttle friction up, then as you take your hand off the throttle closes, and you end up at some stage of the game with one hand on the throttle, one hand on the undercarriage lever, and who's minding the shop? Spitfire, a generation later than the Hurricane, no question about it. It's a monocoque fuselage, so the fuselage is contributing to the strength of the airframe. If you look in the office, it's much cleaner. It's still an open cockpit, so if you drop anything, it's gone forever, but it is much cleaner. You will also notice that, like the Hurricane, the instrument layout is standard, and the RAF use standard instrument layouts all the way through. All the fighters, all the bombers, everything else. Everything had standard instrument layout. This basic 6 flying instruments. The engine instruments were pretty well common as well. And interestingly enough, the control column had got this broken system. In pitch, the whole thing moved from the floor in pitch for you controlling the elevators. But for ailerons, only the top half of the stick moved, and it rotated about that point there. The big advantage of that over the American system, which is just a stick, is that you can get full aileron on without hitting your leg. You can see that the office is quite a lot cleaner than the Hurricane was, and that the prop and the throttle are both on the same quadrant, making life a lot easier when you want to open up the power. Gun sight there, straightforward reflector gun sight. Next generation, the Mustang, wide track undercarriage, hydraulic brakes rather than pneumatic in the previous two, steerable tail wheel, everything retractable of course, and a very fine aeroplane indeed, and lots of fuel. The interesting thing about the Mustang is that on the same engine as the Spitfire, it's 30 miles an hour faster, but it weighs about 2,500, 3,000 pounds more. So it's a heavier aeroplane than the Spitfire, but it's faster on the same horsepower. And the reason for that is the laminar flow wing, plus the fact they got a good deal of thrust recovery out of the coolant system. In fact, I understand that the coolant system, the radiators were completely drag-free. In other words, the amount of thrust equal the drag that the radiator gave. The cockpit of Spencer's aeroplane was modified extensively with modern instrumentation, but the basic layout was the same, and it's got a floor, so it's not an open cockpit. It's also very roomy in comparison with the Spitfire. You could throw a small party in there if you wanted, compared with the Spit. This is the stock aeroplane. You can see the floor down there, so it's all enclosed, but you can see the stick. You put full aileron on a Mustang and you're forever running into your leg. You're banging your leg. But that's the stock aeroplane. Nice cockpit layout, and as I say, very roomy, which when you consider you could take it to Berlin and back, it's not surprising. Turning to this beast, the Sky Raider. Well, post-war aeroplane, obviously, ground attack aeroplane used extensively in Korea and in Vietnam. And a very heavy war load. It had got a grand total of 15 pylons. There's one pylon, there's another one there, and the centre line, they could carry drop tanks or big bombs or whatever. 15 pylons to deal with. The switchery in the cockpit is going to be quite complex, and if you look at the cockpit, it's a pretty mess in there. Fortunately, most of this stuff down here is redundant because most of it is weapon switchery, but it is quite a haphazardly laid out cockpit. The other interesting thing is that despite the aircraft being big, the cockpit is quite small, particularly at shoulder level, and considering with drop tanks on you could probably fly it for 18 hours. It was not the kind of office you'd want to be stuck in there for 18 hours. Fortunately, it did have a P-tube, not that I ever needed to use it, but it did have one. With the curvature of the fuselage, there was plenty of room under the sides on the down at this level, so you could stack stuff away down there. But the thought of spending something like 18 hours in that cockpit would have definitely been something that wouldn't have appealed to me in the least. 5 hours or 6 hours would have been fine. But it's a great airplane to fly. It cruises all day at 180 knots. Just out of interest sake, at one stage of passing Newcastle, I was out to sea in about 500 feet, and I saw these 3 dots out at sea, and I thought, going quite quickly, I thought, what are they? I'll go and have a look. So I went to have a look at them, and there was 3 guys on ski jets, the old ski boats, about 5 miles out at sea, going like the clappers. So they got a quick flyby, and I think they enjoyed it. They didn't fall off. That, I think, is a good spot to break.